I'm a 27-year-old guy who, for as long as I can remember, has been the black sheep of my family. My mom, Julia, is 50, and my stepdad, Rick, is 52. They've always made it pretty clear that my younger siblings, Tyler 25 and Lily 22, are the golden children. I've never fit into the family dynamic the way they do, and growing up, it always felt like my mom had a personal vendetta against me. If there was an award for being overly critical, she'd win it every year. It wasn't always blatant. Julia had a way of slipping digs into everyday conversation. If I got a B in school, she'd bring up how Tyler aced the same class. If I landed a part-time job, she'd ask why I wasn't doing internships like Lily. Rick mostly stayed out of it, which I used to think was neutral, but I've since realized it was more like passive agreement. He was always quick to back her up if things escalated. The tipping point happened a few weeks ago during a family dinner. My family loves these get-togethers. They're more for show than actual bonding, but I try to attend when I can. We were all seated at the table, and the conversation turned to careers. Tyler was boasting about a new promotion he got at work, and Lily was talking about some internship she just scored. Then, it was my turn, and I mentioned how I'd been doing freelance design work for a few months. That's when Julia hit me with it. She sighed dramatically, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You know, sometimes I think you're my biggest regret." The table went silent for a second, but then Tyler chuckled awkwardly, and Lily mumbled something about how I should lighten up. I felt my stomach drop. I wish I could say I stood up and made a grand speech about self-worth or something, but I just sat there, stunned. The worst part wasn't even the comment, it was how quickly the moment was brushed aside, like it was no big deal. Rick poured himself another glass of wine, and Tyler cracked a joke about how I always get so sensitive. Later that night, after the dinner, Tyler and Lily cornered me in the kitchen while I was grabbing leftovers to take home. They didn't waste any time mocking me. Tyler, as usual, was the ringleader, calling me a failure and asking why I couldn't just take a joke. Lily chimed in with some half-hearted agreement, clearly trying to keep the peace but still siding with him. It was like being back in high school, except now I didn't have the excuse of being a kid. I left shortly after that and didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. It wasn't the first time Julia had said something cruel, but it felt different this time. Maybe it was because I'd been trying so hard to make my freelance career work. I'm not rolling in money, but I'm proud of the work I've done. I've been building a portfolio, networking, and even landed a small project with a local startup. Hearing her reduce all of that to regret was a slap in the face. When I told my girlfriend Emma about what happened, she was furious on my behalf. Emma and I have been together for 3 years, and she's one of the few people who's always believed in me. She didn't try to sugarcoat things or tell me to let it go. Instead, she said something that stuck with me: you can't control how your mom sees you, but you can control how much space you let her take up in your life. The next morning, I decided I was done playing along with their games. I wasn't going to let Julia's words define me anymore. I made a plan, focus on my career, set boundaries with my family, and stop looking for validation where I was never going to get it. I started small. First, I blocked Julia and Rick on social media. They weren't the type to comment on posts, but they loved to gossip about whatever I shared, and I didn't need that negativity. I also made it a point to avoid family events unless I genuinely wanted to be there. No more guilt-tripping myself into attending out of obligation. If they wanted to see me, they'd have to make an effort to treat me with respect. I knew that wasn't likely, but just making that decision felt like a weight had been lifted. One thing that helped was a memory from when I was a kid. Back when I was maybe 10 or 11, I'd drawn a picture of our family dog. Julia had actually praised me for it, saying I had real talent. It's one of the only positive memories I have of her, but it reminded me that my creativity was mine, and no one could take that away. I also turned to Reddit for advice. I wrote a post explaining the situation, and the responses were overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared their own stories of toxic parents and how they'd found peace by cutting ties or setting boundaries. It was like a wake-up call. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. With Emma's encouragement, I set a new goal for myself: land a major freelance contract. Not to prove Julia wrong, but to prove to myself that I was capable. It felt like the first real step toward reclaiming my self-respect. Update 1. The first thing I did after deciding to enforce boundaries with my family was stick to my decision not to attend any family gatherings unless there was basic respect. It didn't take long for this to create waves. Julia wasted no time texting me to remind me that family is everything and that I needed to stop being dramatic. I didn't respond. A week later, Rick called me. His tone was overly calm, the kind that immediately feels like manipulation in disguise. He suggested I be the bigger person and apologized to Julia to smooth things over. I told him I wasn't interested in smoothing things over anymore. That conversation ended pretty quickly. Meanwhile, I was pouring my energy into my work. A local startup reached out about a small project designing their website and branding. It wasn't a massive contract, but it was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been looking for. I threw myself into the work, spending late nights sketching out ideas and refining mock-ups. When I sent over the final designs, they were thrilled. It wasn't just about the paycheck, though that part didn't hurt. It was the confidence boost I needed. Julia didn't see it that way. She must have heard about my project through the grapevine, because a few days later I started getting more texts. This time it was about how I was abandoning the family and letting my ego get in the way. I didn't reply, but Tyler stepped in to take her side. He started sending me sarcastic messages, asking if my big break was enough to pay the bills and calling me a loser for cutting ties with the only people who actually care about you. I blocked him. Emma, on the other hand, was a rock. She sat down with me and helped me organize my time so I could juggle a few smaller freelance gigs alongside the startup project. I'd always been good at the creative side of things, but she showed me how to stay on top of deadlines and client communication. With her help, I started building a portfolio that I could be proud of. I spent weeks networking online, joining forums, and even taking on a couple of pro bono projects to showcase my skills. One of those connections turned out to be a goldmine. A Redditor who'd seen my original post about my family reached out with a lead on a high-paying freelance opportunity. It was for a marketing campaign with a mid-sized national company. I jumped on it immediately, and after a few rounds of proposals, they hired me. It was a $15,000 project, the biggest I'd ever landed, and I couldn't believe how quickly things were turning around. Of course, Julia wasn't happy about any of this. She started spreading rumors to our extended family, saying I was lazy and ungrateful. My aunt called me out of the blue one afternoon, clearly hesitant but trying to understand my side of the story. When I told her what had been happening, she admitted she'd heard similar stories from Julia for years. That was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also made me realize how deeply ingrained this narrative had become. Around this time, Emma suggested I try therapy. She said it might help me unpack all the years of emotional abuse and figure out how to move forward without letting my family's toxicity hold me back. I'd never seriously considered therapy before, but I made an appointment. During the first session, I started to see just how much of my life had been shaped by trying to win Julia's approval, a losing battle from the start. Lily, meanwhile, decided to get involved. She sent me a long message accusing me of being selfish and saying Julia had always been right about you. It stung, but I didn't respond. I wasn't going to get dragged into more pointless arguments. Blocking her felt like the healthiest option, so I did. Despite all the family drama, my Reddit posts kept gaining traction. Strangers were commenting with their own stories of toxic parents and how they'd found freedom by setting boundaries. It was validating in a way I hadn't expected. One person even said my story inspired them to go no contact with their own mom. That kind of support made the constant barrage from my family feel less overwhelming. Finishing the $15,000 project was a turning point. The client left a glowing review and even recommended me to another company. With the money I earned, I was able to pay off a lingering debt that had been hanging over me for years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. While sorting through some old boxes in my apartment, I came across a childhood journal I'd forgotten about. Flipping through it was like opening a time capsule. There were sketches of imaginary worlds and notes about projects I wanted to create someday. It was a reminder of the kid I used to be, the one who loved drawing and designing before all the comparisons and criticism started. That memory gave me the motivation to keep moving forward, no matter how messy things got with my family. Update 2. Completing the $15,000 project felt like crossing a major milestone. Not only did the client leave a glowing review, but they also recommended me to another company, which led to more inquiries about my work. Things were finally looking up, and I was gaining momentum. I updated my portfolio with the new project, shared it on a few professional platforms, and started planning my next steps. Meanwhile, Julia was still running her smear campaign. She told anyone who would listen that my so-called success was fake and accused me of lying about my accomplishments. One of my cousins sent me a screenshot of a group chat where Julia claimed I'd exaggerated my earnings and was living off Emma. It was frustrating, but I chose not to engage. If anything, it only solidified my decision to stay low contact. Not everyone bought into her narrative, though. My grandmother, Julia's mom, called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked much in recent years because Julia often controlled the flow of family communication. But Grandma told me she'd heard about my work and wanted me to know how proud she was. She even mentioned how she'd always seen the potential in me, even when others didn't. That call came at the perfect time. It was the first genuine support I'd received from a family member in years, and it meant more than I can put into words. Emma and I celebrated that night with takeout and a lot of brainstorming. She suggested I think about investing in my own design studio. The idea was daunting, but it sparked something in me. We talked about turning it into a space where I could work on larger projects and eventually collaborate with other designers. It felt like a pipe dream, but Emma had a way of making it sound achievable. Therapy was another area where progress was happening. During one session, I started connecting the dots about how much of my life had been driven by a need for validation, specifically from Julia. My therapist helped me see that her approval was something I was never going to get, and that my worth didn't depend on it. It was a hard truth to accept, but it was also freeing. Of course, Tyler wasn't happy about any of this. He found out about my $15,000 project and immediately started downplaying it. He told mutual friends I was lucky to have landed the job and implied I didn't have the talent to keep up that level of success. I didn't confront him directly, but when he tried to message me about it, I told him to stay out of my business. That was the last time we spoke. With Emma's help, I started putting together a plan for the studio. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but I set realistic goals, save a specific amount of money, scout locations, and slowly build a client base that could sustain the overhead. It was exciting to think about, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I was working towards something bigger than myself. Meanwhile, I made my decision to formally go low contact with Julia and Rick. I sent them an email explaining that I wouldn't be attending any family gatherings or engaging with them unless there was mutual respect. Predictably, Julia responded with a passive-aggressive message about how I was tearing the family apart. I didn't reply. Her smear campaign, however, started to backfire. Several family members reached out to me privately, saying they didn't believe the things Julia was saying. A couple of them even apologized for not stepping in sooner. It was a small but meaningful shift, and it gave me hope that not everyone in the family had been drinking Julia's Kool-Aid. Things took another unexpected turn when my work was featured in a local magazine. One of my previous clients had nominated me for a Rising Creative Spotlight, and the magazine did a full write-up about my journey as a freelance designer. I didn't think much of it until I heard through the grapevine that Julia and Rick had seen the article. Apparently it had surprised them, but I wasn't about to reach out and ask what they thought. Tyler, however, was livid. During a family gathering I didn't attend, he reportedly had a meltdown, accusing me of stealing his spotlight. It was ironic since I wasn't even there, but it confirmed what I'd always suspected. Tyler thrived on being the golden child, and any deviation from that narrative rattled him. Emma, being the amazing partner she is, decided to throw me a surprise party to celebrate all the progress I'd made. She invited a few close friends, and even decorated the place with little nods to my design work. It was a simple but meaningful gesture, and it reminded me of how far I'd come with the right support system. The cherry on top came a few days later when my grandmother sent me a package. Inside was an old sketch I'd made as a kid, framed beautifully with a note that read, "Always believed in you." It brought back memories of a time when creativity was something I loved for its own sake, not something tied to proving anyone wrong. To top it all off, my Reddit posts started gaining even more traction. People were sharing them on other platforms, and I started getting messages from strangers thanking me for inspiring them to cut toxic ties. Some even told me they'd started their own journeys toward independence after reading my updates. It was surreal to think my story could have that kind of impact, but it also felt like the ultimate vindication. As I sat in my apartment that night, looking at my childhood sketch and reading through the supportive comments online, I couldn't help but feel like I was finally rising above everything that had held me down for so long. Update 3. Not long after my work got featured in the local magazine, Julia decided to escalate things. She sent me a long email demanding I apologize for ruining her reputation. Apparently, her smear campaign wasn't going as planned, and some family members were starting to side with me. Julia framed her ultimatum as a way to repair the family, but it was clear she was more worried about how she looked. She ended the email with a not-so-subtle threat. If I didn't apologize, she'd disown me. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and went about my day. Later, I replied with a short, straightforward message. "I don't need your approval anymore." That was it. No drama, no explanations. I'd learned by now that trying to reason with Julia was a waste of time. Things got worse when Tyler decided to involve himself. Out of nowhere, I started getting messages from people in my professional circle about a string of screenshots Tyler had posted online. He'd leaked private messages we'd exchanged years ago, twisting them to make it look like I was arrogant and unprofessional. Most of the people who reached out could see through it, but the fact that he tried to sabotage me was a new low, even for him. At the same time, I was making moves to expand my work. With Emma's encouragement, I rented a small co-working space as a test run for my eventual studio. It wasn't much, just a shared office with enough room for a desk, a drafting table, and some basic equipment, but it felt like a step in the right direction. I started hosting casual workshops for local creatives, and the response was better than I expected. Within a few weeks, I had a regular group of people coming in to collaborate and learn from each other. Back on the family front, things took an unexpected turn. Lily called me out of the blue. She was upset, and for the first time, it wasn't aimed at me. Apparently, she'd confronted Julia during a family dinner. She told her point blank that I'd been treated unfairly for years, and that the way she spoke about me was cruel and unnecessary. According to Lily, the conversation ended with Julia storming out of the room. It was hard to believe Lily was finally seeing things clearly, but it felt like progress. Therapy was also starting to pay off. I'd reached a point where I could talk about my family without feeling overwhelmed or bitter. My therapist helped me recognize that I didn't need to fix or change anyone, only myself. That perspective shift made it easier to focus on my goals without getting bogged down by the constant drama. Speaking of drama, Tyler's life seemed to be unraveling. His career, which had always been his bragging point, hit a rough patch. He lost a major client due to some careless mistakes, and his boss wasn't happy. A few days later, he reached out to me, asking for advice. I kept my response simple: I'm not in a position to help. It wasn't about revenge or pettiness. I just wasn't going to let him use me after everything he'd done. Grandma, as always, was a voice of reason. During one of our phone calls, she reminded me that grudges only hold you back. She wasn't pushing me to reconcile with Julia or Tyler, she just wanted me to stay focused on my future. It was advice I took to heart. Meanwhile, the co-working space started to gain traction. Word of mouth spread quickly, and I was getting inquiries from local businesses interested in renting it for events. It became a hub for creatives, and I started to feel like I'd found my niche. Emma, ever the planner, suggested we take things a step further. She proposed that we move in together to cut down on costs and give me more flexibility to invest in the space. It wasn't a hard decision to make. We'd been talking about it for a while, and this felt like the perfect time. While my professional life was thriving, Julia was spiraling. She took to social media to vent about me, posting long rants about how ungrateful I was and how she'd sacrificed everything for me. Most people ignored it, but a few family members reached out to tell me how embarrassing it was to watch. Some even decided to cut ties with her altogether, siding with me instead. The final turning point came with the grand opening of my design studio. After months of hard work, I was able to upgrade from the co-working space to a dedicated studio of my own. Emma helped me plan a small launch party, and I invited some of the clients and collaborators who'd supported me along the way. It was a surreal moment, standing in that space and realizing how far I'd come. Grandma sent me a handwritten note that night, congratulating me and reminding me how proud she was. I framed it and placed it on my desk as a reminder of her unwavering support. By this point, Julia's attempts to control the narrative no longer mattered. Her threats, rants, and manipulations had lost their power. I didn't need her approval, or anyone else's, to feel like I was enough. For the first time in years, I felt free. Update 4. Not long after my studio officially opened, things started to unravel for Julia in ways I hadn't expected. The family had finally grown tired of her behavior, and the stories she'd been spreading about me began to backfire. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, letting me know Julia's reputation within the family was taking a hit. She doubled down on her accusations against me during a family gathering, only to be met with pushback from several aunts and uncles. People were finally starting to see through her manipulation, and it wasn't a good look for her. As the backlash against Julia grew, Tyler made his next move. Out of nowhere, he sent me a text apologizing for his behavior. He said he wanted to put everything behind us and move forward, but it was clear his apology was more about damage control than genuine remorse. I didn't respond. At this point, I wasn't interested in rekindling relationships that had brought me nothing but negativity. Around the same time, I had a major breakthrough in therapy. After months of digging into my past and understanding the impact of my family dynamics, I finally felt strong enough to step away from therapy. My therapist agreed, saying I had made incredible progress and seemed ready to continue growing on my own. It wasn't the end of my healing journey, but it was a big milestone that felt like a personal victory. Meanwhile, my extended family started showing their support more openly. Several aunts and uncles reached out to tell me how proud they were of everything I'd accomplished. One aunt even shared that she'd always known Julia was harsh on me, but hadn't felt it was her place to intervene. Hearing that was bittersweet, but I appreciated her honesty. For the first time, it felt like I had a support network beyond Emma and a few close friends. The studio, on the other hand, was thriving. I landed my first six-figure client, a massive branding project for a national company, and it was a game changer. The financial stability this provided allowed me to hire a small team and expand the studio's services. We went from working on local projects to pitching ideas to companies I'd only dreamed of collaborating with. The growth was surreal, but it also reinforced that I was on the right path. As my professional life soared, Julia's isolation deepened. She began losing the support of her social circle as more people heard about how she'd treated me over the years. Rick, ever the passive player in all this, quietly distanced himself from the drama. According to my cousin, he barely spoke up when people confronted Julia about her behavior, letting her face the fallout alone. It seemed like the cracks in their dynamic were starting to show. Tyler wasn't doing much better. His career continued to struggle, and his relationship with his girlfriend reportedly ended after a massive argument. Family gossip pinned a lot of Tyler's frustrations on Julia's favoritism, which had clearly left him unprepared to handle adversity. It was a strange turn of events, but I stayed out of it. His choices weren't my responsibility. Lily, however, surprised me again. She reached out to apologize for her past behavior, admitting she'd been blind to how unfairly I'd been treated. Her message felt genuine, and while I wasn't ready to fully rebuild our relationship, I appreciated the effort. It was a small step, but it showed that change was possible, even in the most dysfunctional family dynamics. Emma, being the incredible partner she is, organized a celebration to mark 1 year since the studio's launch. She invited close friends, clients, and even a few of the people I'd met through Reddit who had become part of my support system. It was a night filled with laughter, gratitude, and a sense of accomplishment. Emma's unwavering belief in me had been a cornerstone of my journey, and celebrating together felt like the perfect way to honor how far we'd come. To top it all off, my story was featured in a national publication as part of a series on entrepreneurs who overcame adversity. The article highlighted not just my professional success, but also the personal challenges I'd faced along the way. It brought in a wave of new opportunities and solidified the studio's reputation in the industry. I couldn't have asked for a better way to close this chapter of my life. And then came Julia's letter. She sent it through Grandma, asking her to pass it along since I'd blocked Julia on every platform. In the letter, Julia pleaded for reconciliation, saying she regretted how things had turned out and wanted a chance to make things right. It was hard to know how much of it was sincere and how much was just damage control after losing her social circle. Either way, I didn't respond. I'd made peace with the fact that I didn't need closure from Julia to move forward. Emma and I started planning a trip to Europe, a long overdue adventure that would be the perfect way to leave the toxicity of my past behind. We mapped out an itinerary, booked tickets, and set a goal to focus on nothing but the future. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. From being the family's scapegoat to building a life I'm proud of, the journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Julia's downfall was never my goal, but it became an inevitable consequence of her actions. As I sit in my studio surrounded by the life I've built, I can finally say I've found peace, not through anyone else's validation, but through my own growth and resilience. Update 5. The past year has been a whirlwind. My design studio has gone from a small operation to a thriving business, and we've even started earning recognition in the industry. Last month, we won an award for Innovative Creative Studio of the Year, which opened the door to partnerships with even bigger clients. What started as a solo freelance hustle has now grown into a full-fledged company with a small but talented team. It feels surreal to say it, but the studio is officially a success. As my professional life reached new heights, Julia and Rick made a few more attempts to reach out. Julia tried to get in touch through mutual relatives, dropping hints that she wanted to reconnect. Rick stayed true to form, avoiding confrontation but sending vague messages through others about how family should stick together. I didn't engage. It wasn't about holding a grudge, it was about protecting the peace I'd worked so hard to build. Tyler, surprisingly, seems to have turned a corner. Word got around that he started therapy after his career hit a major low. A mutual friend mentioned that Tyler had been working through a lot of his own issues, including resentment toward Julia for the way she played favorites. He even reached out to me indirectly, telling someone in our family that my journey had inspired him to seek help. I wasn't sure how to feel about that, but I hoped he could find his own path forward. Lily and I, on the other hand, have started rebuilding our relationship. She's made an effort to stay in touch, and we've had a few long conversations about the past. It's not perfect, and there's still some distance, but it feels like a step in the right direction. Recently, she even asked for advice on a new project she's working on, which was a first. For once, it didn't feel like we were stuck in old patterns. One of the most unexpected moments came during a family reunion. I wasn't planning to attend, but Grandma asked me to come, so I went for her. At one point, she stood up and made a short speech about how proud she was of me and all I'd accomplished. She didn't call anyone out directly, but her words made it clear she was addressing the people who had doubted me. Seeing her so openly supportive in front of everyone was a moment I'll never forget. Emma, as always, has been my biggest cheerleader. After seeing how much the studio had grown, she suggested we make it official and bring her on as a partner. She has a sharp eye for business strategy, and with her help, we've expanded our services and streamlined our operations. Having her as part of the team has strengthened our relationship in ways I didn't know were possible. As for Julia, the cracks in her armor are finally starting to show. According to one of my cousins, she recently admitted to a relative that she might have been too hard on me growing up. While she stopped short of a full apology, it was the closest she's ever come to taking responsibility. I wasn't holding my breath for an apology, but hearing about it from someone else was a strange mix of validation and sadness. With the studio's success, I wanted to give back in a meaningful way. I decided to donate to a local art school that runs programs for underprivileged kids. They focus on fostering creativity and teaching practical skills, and I know how much it would have meant to have that kind of support when I was younger. The donation was anonymous, but it felt like a way to close the loop on my journey. The ripple effect of my story online has been another unexpected gift. After my updates went viral, more people started sharing their own experiences with toxic family dynamics. A few even credited me for helping them take the first steps towards setting boundaries or pursuing their dreams. It's humbling to know my story resonated with so many people, and it's a reminder of how much can change when you take control of your own narrative. Tyler's progress hasn't been limited to therapy. He recently launched a small business, and from what I hear, it's starting to take off. During a conversation with one of our cousins, he apparently credited me as the inspiration for starting his venture. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or be flattered, but I decided to let it be. Julia, for her part, seems to have finally stopped trying to reach out. It's as if she's realized I'm not going to respond, no matter how much she tries to spin the situation. Her silence has been the loudest acknowledgement yet that I've truly moved on. In the midst of all this, Emma and I decided to take the next step in our relationship. During a quiet night at home, I proposed, and she said yes. We've started planning a small wedding, and the thought of building a future together feels like the perfect conclusion to everything we've been through. One of the last things I did as part of my healing process was write a letter to Julia. I didn't send it, it wasn't for her. It was for me. In the letter, I let go of all the resentment, pain, and disappointment I'd carried for so long. I folded it up, tucked it away in a drawer, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. As I sit here, reflecting on everything, I feel a sense of closure I never thought was possible. I didn't prove Julia wrong for her, I did it for me. This journey has taught me that strength comes from within, and the life I've built is proof of that. Looking back, I'm grateful for every step, even the painful ones, because they've led me to where I am now. This is my full circle moment, and it's better than I ever imagined. Hey, I'm 28M, and until recently I thought I had a pretty typical family life. Growing up, we weren't exactly the kind to have those loud, chaotic family dinners, but I always thought we were close in our own way. My parents were the everything in its place kind of people, maybe a little controlling, but I always saw that as their way of showing they cared. But over the past few weeks, things have completely unraveled in a way I never expected. It started at a family gathering. It was just one of those typical weekends with my cousins, uncles, aunts, and grandparents all packed into one house. I hadn't seen everyone together like that in a while, and honestly, I wasn't paying much attention at first. But at one point, my cousin casually mentioned something about the other sibling, and it stopped me in my tracks. He brushed it off like it was nothing, but I could feel this strange, sinking feeling in my stomach. Growing up, I'd always been the youngest of two, with my older brother Adam being the only other sibling I'd known. But other sibling? That was new. Trying to keep things normal, I asked a few other family members, making it sound casual. No one wanted to give a straight answer, and the more I asked, the more uncomfortable everyone seemed. I could sense people shooting each other strange looks, and there were a lot of quick, "Oh, I don't really know, and maybe you should ask your parents about that." That night, I couldn't let it go. The whole way home, I kept replaying every conversation in my head. There was something about the way everyone acted that made it clear they were all hiding something, and whatever it was, it had to do with me. I decided to talk to my parents about it the next day. When I asked them directly, they didn't take it well. My mom looked a bit caught off guard, but she quickly recovered. pretending like she had no clue what I was talking about. My dad just sort of brushed it off, saying families have a way of making things up sometimes. Don't listen to everything you hear. I tried to dig deeper, but both of them kept stonewalling, acting almost annoyed that I was even bringing it up. So feeling more confused than ever, I decided to do a little digging on my own. We have this old storage room at home where we keep boxes of old stuff, yearbooks, documents, photos, all that. My mom never let us go in there, claiming it was just junk, but I'd seen her digging through there every now and then. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I decided to take a look. I didn't have to search long. Right near the top of one of the boxes, I found a file with my name on it. But that wasn't the strange part. Inside, I found old papers, medical records, and even some photos I'd never seen before. Some of them had my parents in them, but in a few there was a woman I didn't recognize. I flipped through, and there she was again in another photo, holding me as a baby. Then, at the bottom of the stack, there was a birth certificate, a different one from the one I'd always known. And right there, under mother and father, were two completely different names. My head started spinning. I tried telling myself there had to be some logical explanation, but every new paper I found just made things worse. The next day, I went to my older brother, Adam, hoping he could give me some answers. Adam has always been the follow-the-rules type, so I figured if anyone knew something, it would be him. When I brought it up, he went quiet. After a long pause, he admitted he knew some of the story but said it was too painful to talk about and that our parents had decided it was better if I never found out. That hit me hard. He knew, and had known for years. He wouldn't give me any more details, just kept insisting it wasn't his place to tell me, and that I should just let it go. I could feel the frustration boiling up, but he wasn't budging. After that, things started to feel tense around my parents. Anytime I brought up anything about our family, even things that seemed harmless, they'd get quiet and change the topic or leave the room. It was like they were trying to erase every question before it even came up. At a total loss, I tried asking a few other relatives, especially those who weren't as close to my parents. They all seemed uncomfortable, but I did pick up a few new pieces here and there. One aunt mentioned something about a difficult choice my parents had made, while another relative vaguely hinted that I wasn't originally supposed to be in the picture. But no one would go beyond these vague comments, and I kept hitting walls. Finally, I decided to go online and dig through some records myself. I pulled up whatever I could from old archives, hospital records, and even school records, but it was like chasing shadows. Every lead seemed to dead end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a whole part of my life missing that everyone else seemed to know about. The tipping point came when I mentioned this to a close family friend's parent. They gave me a strange look and mumbled something about that adoption. My heart stopped. Adoption? But before I could press further, they quickly clammed up, saying it wasn't their place and that my parents probably wanted to talk about it when the time was right. I knew, then, that this wasn't some family misunderstanding or a rumor. I was adopted. Or, at least it was beginning to look that way. After all the deflections, the strange looks, and the hidden documents, I realized I couldn't trust my parents to be upfront with me. I had to confront them one last time and finally get the truth out. Update 1. After everything I'd uncovered, I finally sat my parents down, determined to get answers. It took some pushing, but eventually they admitted the truth: I was adopted. But the shock didn't stop there. My birth parents weren't strangers. They were my mom's sister and her husband, my aunt and uncle. They'd struggled financially back then and couldn't afford to raise me, so my parents stepped in. They agreed to take me in and raise me as their own. They went on, saying that my aunt and uncle had made this decision out of love, that they'd thought it was the best thing for me. My parents kept repeating that they'd done it to give me a better life. But the more they explained, the stranger it felt to hear. Every memory I'd grown up with, every little moment, suddenly it all felt like a story I'd been told, not a life I'd lived. After that conversation, I felt I needed to know more. I went back to Adam, hoping he'd finally give me something concrete. He admitted he'd known for a while, but said he'd been told it was too painful to discuss, and that everyone had agreed it was best if I didn't find out. I remember just staring at him, realizing that even he had been in on this secret. It wasn't just my parents, my own brother had been keeping it from me too. The next few days were a blur. I kept going over everything in my mind, trying to piece together all these memories with this new information. I remembered my grandparents being very involved in my life, always there for birthdays and holidays. Turns out they had also been in on the whole thing from the start. They had even been the ones to convince my aunt and uncle that I'd be better off with my parents. To them, it was all about protecting me, but hearing it just made everything feel worse. At this point, I felt like I needed to talk to the people who'd actually brought me into this world. I found my aunt and uncle's number and gave them a call, not really sure what to expect. My aunt picked up, and when I started explaining why I was calling, she got really quiet. After a few moments, she told me she'd always wondered if this day would come. We set up a time to meet in person. When we finally sat down together, she was visibly emotional. She told me that giving me up was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but at the time, they genuinely thought it was for the best. My uncle joined in, explaining that they had been dealing with serious financial problems, and they couldn't give me the life they wanted for me. He admitted he'd carried guilt over that decision for years. It was clear they hadn't had it easy, and they truly believed that my parents could provide me with a stable life. As we talked, I started to feel the weight of how complicated all this was. They both said they had never stopped caring about me, and that they'd kept tabs on how I was doing, even if they couldn't be there themselves. My aunt broke down, saying she'd always thought of me as her son but felt she'd lost that right when they gave me up. It was emotional, intense, and way more than I'd expected going in. Of course, this conversation didn't stay a secret. Word got back to my parents and things turned tense. They weren't thrilled about me reaching out to my aunt and uncle. My mom said she felt like her years of raising me had been thrown away. My dad tried to stay calm, but eventually admitted he was upset that my aunt and uncle seemed to be rewriting history by showing up now and acting as if they were the real parents. All of it started causing a huge rift between them and my birth parents. Both sides kept saying they'd done the right thing for me, but no one was talking to each other anymore, just to me. I confided in a few close friends, trying to make sense of it all. Their reactions ranged from shock to sympathy, with a few even getting angry on my behalf. They couldn't believe my entire family had kept this secret for so long, especially when it was something that directly affected me. It felt good to have their support, especially since I wasn't getting that from my family at the moment. Even my brother Adam eventually tried to explain himself. He said he'd found out when he was a teenager but had been told not to say anything because it would disrupt the family harmony. He didn't like keeping it from me, he said, but he'd felt like he had no choice. I couldn't decide whether to be more angry or frustrated with him, but it added to this feeling that everyone had been in on something I hadn't. Meanwhile, my parents were getting defensive. They kept saying that they'd done what they thought was best and that keeping the truth from me was supposed to protect me. My mom insisted that they wanted me to feel more loved and stable in my life, even if that meant keeping me in the dark. But their explanations didn't make me feel any better. It just felt like they were doubling down, trying to justify the choices they'd made years ago. At that point, I knew I needed help to work through all this, so I decided to start therapy. My first session was eye-opening. I realized I'd never really processed my childhood. Everything had always been so carefully controlled, and I'd never questioned it until now. It was like I was just starting to see my own life clearly for the first time, and I had a long way to go to figure out what that even meant. Update 2. Not long after my first therapy session, I got another bombshell. My birth parents had another child, a half-sibling. They never told him about me, so he had no idea I even existed. When he found out, he was as shocked as I'd been, maybe even more. We set up a time to meet, and the whole thing felt surreal, like meeting a stranger who somehow already knew part of my story. When we met, he looked at me for a moment before shaking his head, saying he couldn't believe our parents had kept this secret from him. He'd grown up thinking he was an only child. Now, he was being told he had an older half-brother who'd been placed with his aunt and uncle. It felt strange, meeting this person who shared my blood but had no place in my life until now. Despite the awkwardness, he surprised me by saying he wanted to get to know me, saying we shouldn't let their decisions stop us from connecting. Soon after, more family members started reaching out. I wasn't sure how they even knew, but they all seemed to have their own piece of the story. A few aunts and uncles mentioned they'd known about the adoption but had been told to stay out of it to avoid complicating things. Some had thought I knew by now, and were just as stunned to find out I'd been in the dark for 28 years. It became clear that almost everyone in the family had played a part in keeping me from the truth, whether by active choice or by simply staying quiet. When my grandparents heard about everything going on, they didn't waste time defending their choice. They didn't apologize or act surprised. If anything, they looked almost proud. They insisted they'd done what was best for everyone and claimed that back then, these choices were normal. They said times were different, as if that explained everything. In their minds, they'd kept me safe. End of story. It was clear they had no regrets about their decision. But the secret's exposure was starting to cause drama across the whole family. Some relatives were furious, saying I should have been told years ago, while others thought I was stirring up trouble. Lines were being drawn, with people taking sides. I hadn't intended to create all this chaos, but the truth was out now, and there was no going back. The one person who seemed genuinely supportive was my half-sibling. After our first awkward meeting, he reached out again, saying he wanted us to keep getting to know each other. We started meeting up regularly, talking about everything from our childhoods to our favorite movies. He was the first person who didn't try to defend anyone or justify what happened. Instead, he just listened, which was more than I could say for most of my family. Having him in my life started to feel like something solid in the middle of all this chaos. Meanwhile, therapy was helping me piece together bits of my past that I hadn't even realized I'd forgotten. I started remembering things from my childhood that I'd brushed off before. Moments when my parents would get cagey or tell me to stop asking questions. It was like a pattern of control I'd been blind to. I started recognizing that I'd grown up constantly monitored, with decisions made for me to keep me safe or give me stability. Therapy was helping me see how that had shaped the way I saw myself, and it wasn't pretty. One evening, everything came to a head with my adoptive parents. I confronted them, not just about the adoption but about everything, the secrecy, the control, and the way they'd handled things with my birth parents. They didn't take it well. My mom got defensive, saying she'd done what she thought was right. My dad said they'd tried to protect me from a complicated life, as if that made it all okay. After a heated argument, I finally told them I needed space, that I couldn't just move on like they wanted. For the first time, I saw real hurt in their eyes, but I couldn't back down. My friends encouraged me to stick with my boundaries. They pointed out that I'd been through a lot, and it was okay to take a step back to protect myself. They didn't know the whole story, but they understood enough to realize that I needed time away from the people who'd built my life on a lie. They helped me see that it was okay to choose my own well-being over family expectations. Around this time, my birth parents also started reaching out more, expressing guilt over the way things had unfolded. My birth mother said she wished they'd tried harder to be a part of my life, while my birth father admitted that their decision had haunted them over the years. It didn't make up for the lost time, but hearing them acknowledge their regrets made it easier for me to see that they weren't trying to rewrite history, they were just struggling with it like I was. With my half-sibling by my side, I started doing some research on my own, wondering if there were legal documents tied to the adoption. I wanted to know if there had been any unusual arrangements. I dug through public records and even consulted a lawyer friend, hoping there might be something that would give me more answers. I hadn't found anything concrete yet, but the search itself was helping me take control of the situation for once. Of course, my extended family wasn't thrilled about my digging. A few relatives outright criticized me, saying I was only creating problems where there didn't need to be any. I heard more than one person call me dramatic, saying I was wasting time and should just move on. But others were supportive, reaching out to say they understood why I needed answers. Then, as if things weren't complicated enough, my adoptive parents hit me with an ultimatum. They told me that I could either choose to forgive them and move forward, or I'd risk being cut off. It was their way of trying to control the situation, but it only made things clearer for me. I realized I couldn't keep pretending like nothing had happened. I told them I was choosing my own path, even if it meant losing some of them along the way. Update 3. Meeting up with my half-sibling became a regular thing. It felt strange, but in a good way. Growing up, he'd always been an only child, and he admitted that finding out he had a brother was a lot to process. But he was excited about it too, like he'd found something he'd been missing without even realizing it. We'd go out for coffee or grab lunch, swapping stories about our childhoods. He even told me how he'd always wanted a sibling, but it was never really an option for his parents. Now, having me around was something he hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. Around the same time, my birth parents started reaching out more, trying to make up for all the lost years. They suggested we take a trip to their hometown so they could share more about their lives and family history. They seemed genuinely eager to reconnect. And while I wasn't sure about it, I figured it might help piece things together. But before any of that could happen, my adoptive parents invited me to a family dinner. I hesitated, knowing this could be tense, but I accepted. To my surprise, they'd also invited my birth parents and half-sibling. I could tell right away this wasn't going to go smoothly. The dinner started awkwardly, with everyone making forced small talk, and it only got more uncomfortable from there. At some point, my mom started making little jabs, subtle enough to seem harmless but clearly aimed at my birth parents. She mentioned how they'd taken advantage of her and my dad, emotionally pushing them to take on a responsibility that wasn't originally theirs. My birth parents stayed quiet, but I could see my birth father's jaw tense. My half-sibling gave me a look across the table, like he was just as uncomfortable as I was. Eventually, my birth father couldn't hold back and said they'd made the best decision they could at the time, given the circumstances. He reminded my mom that she and my dad had agreed it was best for me, not something they'd been forced into. Tensions built up, and eventually, my adoptive parents left the room to cool down. That was my cue to leave too. I pulled my half-sibling aside and told him we'd catch up later. Over the next few therapy sessions, I started working through all of this, recognizing how much my adoptive parents' control had shaped my life. They'd always had this way of making their decisions sound like they were for my benefit, but I was starting to see how much of it was really about maintaining control. My therapist helped me realize that if I wanted to start healing, I needed to set some serious boundaries with them. Around that time, I got an invitation to a large family gathering. I had mixed feelings about it. I wasn't sure how many people there knew the whole story, and it seemed like one of those events where everyone would be whispering behind my back. But I went, hoping I'd find at least a few family members who might understand. At the gathering, a couple of cousins came over, the ones I'd always been close to, and they seemed genuinely empathetic. They told me they'd always sensed there was something strange about my situation, but never fully understood why things had been kept secret. Hearing that made me feel a little less alone, like maybe not everyone was on board with how things had been handled. Later that evening, I had a chance to talk to my grandparents. I laid everything out for them, explaining how the secrecy and deceit had affected me and how it was tearing the family apart now. They listened but didn't seem particularly moved. They just repeated what I'd heard before: we did what was best for you. They said their generation believed in protecting children in ways that might seem old-fashioned now, as if that justified everything. It was clear they weren't about to change their minds. Feeling the weight of everything, I ended up making a vague post on social media that night. It wasn't detailed, but I mentioned discovering hidden truths about my family that had changed my life. The response was surprising. Friends and even a few extended family members reached out, offering their support. Some people messaged, sharing their own family secrets, while others just wanted to let me know they were there for me. It felt like a small relief, knowing that not everyone thought I was causing unnecessary drama. My birth parents reached out again, this time admitting that they'd felt pressured by my grandparents to give me up. They'd wanted to be a part of my life, but they felt my adoptive parents and grandparents made it almost impossible. It added a new layer to everything, knowing that they, too, had been controlled in a way. They weren't trying to rewrite history, they were finally opening up about their own struggles with what had happened. My adoptive parents found out about my conversations with my birth parents and weren't happy about it. They accused them of trying to win me over by changing the narrative, as if this was all some competition for my affection. I didn't engage, it was clear nothing I could say would change their minds. Instead, I decided it was time to take a break from them, to focus on my own healing without their influence constantly hanging over me. With this newfound distance, I started thinking more about who I was outside of their expectations. My half-sibling was a big inspiration in that regard. He'd grown up with more freedom, and it showed in how he approached life. He didn't feel the same weight of family expectations, and seeing that made me want the same for myself. I was starting to see a path forward, one that didn't rely on anyone else's rules. I'm still in touch with my birth parents, and things are moving slowly. I think we all know there's a lot of healing to be done, but at least they're willing to talk openly, which is more than I've gotten from anyone else in my family. I'm building something new with my half-sibling, creating our own little version of family. It feels like a step in the right direction, away from secrets and towards something real. Update 4. As the weeks went by, my family started to feel like a battlefield. People were picking sides. Some relatives, mostly on my mom's side, thought I should forgive and forget, insisting that holding on to old wounds would only hurt me in the end. Meanwhile, a few aunts and cousins from my dad's side reached out to say they supported me, telling me that secrets this big should never have been kept. The family was divided, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Then, out of nowhere, my adoptive parents showed up one day, asking for a talk. They seemed calmer than they'd been at that disastrous family dinner. They told me they wanted a fresh start and asked if I could give them a chance to explain their side of things one last time. They admitted they should have told me the truth sooner, but then tried to excuse it by saying they didn't know how I would handle it. They even shared some half-truths about my childhood, but it all felt too rehearsed, like they'd decided in advance what parts to leave out. Meanwhile, my birth parents called me up to have a real conversation, not just about the past, but about what they'd wanted back then. In that heart-to-heart, they revealed something I hadn't known. Years ago, they'd thought about reclaiming custody. My birth mother said they'd wrestled with the decision for months, but ultimately they hadn't wanted to turn my life upside down. Hearing this changed something for me. They'd made peace with their decision a long time ago, but their regret was clear. They just hadn't felt they had any right to step back in after all the choices that had been made. This conversation made me start wondering about my own legal rights. I decided to meet with a lawyer just to understand the finer details of my adoption and to see if there were any family-related legal aspects I should be aware of, like inheritance or other family arrangements. During our meeting, the lawyer pointed out a strange clause in the adoption papers, an unusual agreement between my adoptive and birth parents. It hinted that there might have been some arrangement or expectation beyond the adoption itself, something pre-planned that was never discussed openly. After that, an aunt from my dad's side reached out, hinting that there were things about the adoption she hadn't felt comfortable sharing before. She was careful with her words, but mentioned there'd been family pressure around my adoption, with my grandparents insisting that I was better off with my adoptive parents. She said she'd felt pushed aside when she questioned it, almost like the decision had already been made without room for any debate. She wanted to tell me more but was hesitant, and I could tell it was a struggle for her. With everything coming to the surface, even my friends started weighing in. A couple of them felt I was digging up too much drama and that maybe I should just let the past stay buried. One friend even stopped talking to me altogether, saying I was letting this family stuff take over my life. It stung, but it helped me see who my real friends were. My half-sibling was the one who really understood, pointing out that this wasn't just about the adoption. This was about me reclaiming my own life, understanding where I came from, and finally having control over my own story. Setting boundaries became a priority. I told my adoptive parents clearly that I wasn't ready to reconcile unless they could address the past without dismissing or downplaying it. Until then, I needed some space. They didn't take it well, but I didn't budge. I realized I couldn't keep bending for them without losing myself in the process. Things with my grandparents took a turn, too. After my confrontation with them at the family gathering, they stopped reaching out. It was like they'd closed the door on me, as if I'd somehow betrayed them by challenging their choices. I'd grown up thinking they were the anchors of our family, but now it felt like their silence was punishment for questioning their authority. On the other hand, my relationship with my birth parents was slowly evolving. We started meeting more often, and I even invited them to meet a few of my close friends. It felt strange at first, but they seemed genuinely interested in knowing who I was as a person. They didn't push or pry, just accepted that we were trying to build something new from scratch. I also started revisiting places from my childhood. I went back to the old park where my family used to take me, the one where my adoptive mom would bring a picnic and keep an eye on me like a hawk. I remembered moments I hadn't thought about in years, little things that now seemed like hints of the control they'd held over me. I started journaling about these memories, trying to put together a picture of what my life had really been, not just what I'd been told it was. My siblings began to take sides too. Adam, my older brother, told me he thought it was good that I was finally getting answers. He admitted he'd always felt uneasy about keeping the secret, but had gone along with it because he didn't want to rock the boat. My other sibling, however, sided with my adoptive parents, saying I was causing more problems than necessary and that it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. A few friends became even more supportive, helping me process everything. One close friend became my go-to person, listening whenever I needed to vent and encouraging me to keep setting boundaries. Their support gave me the strength to push forward with my journey, even when it felt like everyone else was pulling me in different directions. After all this, I realized it was time to focus on what mattered to me. I was done letting the family's expectations dictate my life. With my half-sibling's encouragement, I started making plans to build a new path for myself. I didn't want my life to be defined by secrets and lies. I wanted to create something real and honest. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the first time I felt truly ready to leave the past behind. Update 5. After months of navigating family secrets and conflicts, I realized I needed a fresh start. I decided to move to a new city. It was a huge decision, but it felt like the only way to fully step out from under the family dynamics that had controlled me for so long. Packing up my life wasn't easy, and the process felt surreal, but the thought of getting a clean break kept me going. Once I settled into my new place, I made the choice to limit contact with my adoptive parents and grandparents. They hadn't reached out since my last conversation with them, and I was done chasing after people who refused to see things from my side. Letting go was tough, especially knowing I might not hear from them again, but I knew I needed to protect my own peace. Meanwhile, my bond with my half-sibling was stronger than ever. We started planning a trip together, a real brotherly adventure, just us exploring a new place. It was the kind of trip I'd always imagined having with a sibling, but it had never been possible until now. As we went over plans and laughed about all the things we'd do, I felt a sense of connection that had been missing from my life. My birth parents were becoming a more consistent presence, too. They came to visit me in the new city, and we spent time just getting to know each other better. It wasn't forced or awkward. We took things slowly, letting the relationship grow naturally. We'd go out for dinners, explore nearby parks, or just have movie nights. These were small things, but for me they represented the kind of family moments I'd always wanted. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. Therapy remained a huge part of my journey. The sessions were intense, but they helped me confront the trust issues and self-doubt that had been building for years. Week by week, I started to understand more about who I was outside of all these family expectations. I wasn't just the adopted kid or the kept secret. I was someone with my own life, and I had the right to shape it however I wanted. With the family drama mostly behind me, I reached out to a few cousins who had been supportive through everything. They'd respected my decisions and hadn't tried to influence me one way or another. These relationships turned into something I could rely on, a chosen family I could call on whenever I needed someone to talk to or just hang out with. Building this circle helped me feel less alone, and it reminded me that family didn't have to mean obligation. It could mean genuine connection. I also started to see growth in my career. I had more energy and focus, and without the constant weight of family secrets, I finally felt like I could fully invest in my work. My confidence grew, and I started taking on new challenges that I would have avoided before. It was amazing to see how much progress I could make when I wasn't tied down by emotional baggage. Through my half-sibling, I met a new group of friends. They didn't know the details of my family background, which felt refreshing. These people saw me as just me, not as someone with a complicated past. I started going to social events, game nights, and casual meetups, finally experiencing the kind of social life I'd always wanted. It gave me a chance to relax and just enjoy being in the moment without thinking about what anyone thought of me. Slowly, even some of my extended family began reaching out. A couple of them admitted they'd judged me too quickly, and they apologized for not being more supportive when everything first came to light. Some were just curious about why I'd made the choices I did, wanting to understand rather than criticize. It didn't make up for everything, but it felt like a step toward healing. I appreciated that they were willing to see things from my side, and it felt good to have people who were truly trying to understand. Then, unexpectedly, my adoptive parents sent a letter. In it, they apologized for keeping the truth from me for so long, though they still defended their reasons. They insisted that they'd done what they thought was best. Reading it was strange, it was heartfelt. Yet I could feel they still didn't fully grasp the impact of their choices. It left me with mixed emotions, but I set it aside, deciding not to respond right away. As for my grandparents, they kept their silence. There were no calls, no messages, nothing. It hurt, knowing they'd chosen to shut me out entirely. But I found comfort in knowing I'd stood up for myself, even if it meant losing them. I wasn't willing to go back to pretending just to keep the peace. In my new life, I found myself drawn to creative projects. I took up writing and started working on a personal project, capturing all the memories and emotions from the past year. It became a way to release everything I'd been holding inside, turning the chaos of my family history into something that made sense to me. Creating was therapeutic, a way to channel everything I'd been through into something I could look back on with pride. One day, my half-sibling surprised me with a scrapbook. It was filled with photos from our outings, trips, and random moments. It even had little notes he'd written about our conversations and the things we'd learned about each other. It felt like a fresh start, a way to look forward rather than back. We talked about creating new traditions, like holiday getaways or regular meetups, just us reclaiming what family meant for ourselves. Finally, I decided to write a post reflecting on this whole journey. I talked about the shock of discovering the truth, the chaos that followed, and the steps I'd taken to reclaim my own life. I wrote about the importance of choosing who to keep close and how healing can come from the most unexpected places. As I finished the post, I felt a sense of resilience and hope, a feeling that, for the first time, I was truly free to be myself.